Hello, I'm Sara Davies. I'm Associate Professor of International Relations at the Centre for Governance and Public Policy at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. The inspiration for the article, well, it was one statement that was made at the time of the Zika outbreak, and then it was also our interest in what was being discussed about the Ebola outbreak. What triggered Belinda and my interest in this was a statement that was made by a number of countries that were potentially going to be affected by the Zika outbreak. So Ecuador, Jamaica, Brazil, Colombia, where there was statements made about women needing to exercise control over their bodies to not fall pregnant. And one of the things that made us both alarmed about that advice, which we then saw picked up and continued, in particular by the World Health Organization, was the lack of discussion about the limits that had already been in place in a number of these countries on women being able to access free and safe contraceptives, and women being able to also access the right to terminate a pregnancy. There were legal provisions against women being able to do this. There were legal penalties for women in some of these countries that seek to end a pregnancy. And to us, this advice ran completely opposite to the type of environment that had allowed women to be able to exercise that type of authority over their bodies up to this point. So we were concerned about the contradictory advice that we saw occurring. With the Ebola outbreak emergency, what we were particularly interested in was the effect that that outbreak had had in particular on women and the health of women. So you had, in the case of Liberia, but also Guinea and to some extent Sierra Leone, the three countries most affected by the Ebola outbreak, situations where women's health were already significantly disadvantaged by the periods of civil war and unrest that had occurred in each of these countries over the previous decade. And there was a situation where women in particular and their children were at higher risk of maternal and infant mortality. They were at higher risk of malarial infection, and there was reports coming out that the effect of Ebola on these populations was going to be profound. It was going to be another generation now where they would continue to have worse health outcomes because of the delays that had occurred during this period of outbreak and being able to access medical care. And on top of that, there was also the socioeconomic devastation of this Ebola, where you had the shutdown of markets in Freetown, Liberia, which was primarily women engaging in these trading roles in these markets. And the shutdown of that, the imposition of emergency law during that period had a dramatic effect on women and their children having to move out of their homes, being displaced, and the general sense of violence and unrest that we know, for example, had happened in Liberia in that initial period of the outbreak, of that fear, has particular effects on women which we know are different to men from previous studies of disaster response and how gender-based violence, for example, can rise during these periods. So again, what we were concerned about was we know that this can happen, and yet again we didn't feel that the international advisories that were being released about how to manage and deal with the Ebola response, particularly around risk communication, was not taking into account that different populations were experiencing this outbreak very differently, which would affect their ability to control how they could protect themselves from this outbreak.